Okay, well, there are lots of other people that are far better than me to kick off an open source conference, so I'm not sure why I'm up here at the start. But I'll also make a pitch. I'm doing a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the data that you'll see here in my 15-minute slot. What I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about what I am seeing in the open source space. I've been covering open source as an analyst since 2007 when our previous Forrester analyst decided he'd rather go race modified BMWs instead. I think he got the better end of the deal, although I love working in the open source space. But I don't want to just talk to you about open source today and its place. I want to talk to you about why it matters and how it's changing our industry and just becoming a part of it. And I think one of the things that has resulted, not just from open source, but some of the other technology changes that have happened in concert with it, is that if you're a developer, I can't think of a better time, certainly in the 22 plus years that I've been writing code, but almost in the entire history of our industry, that it's been a great time to be a developer. It is literally a golden age. And that's my message to you if you write code. Now, if you have people working for you that write code, there's a second part to that message, that you need to understand how things are changing, how things like open source are part of that process, or else you risk being consumed by the generational changes that are going on in our space. So let me talk a little bit about those in detail. I want to start with a quote from Mark Suster from GRP Partners, because it's illustrative of the combined effect of the changes that we're seeing in our space. When I started in 97 at Rational Software, we were about maybe 300 people at that point in time, maybe 100 of us in dev, building development tools. And when I think about how we started up companies back at that point, when you got your Series A, or maybe your Series B, depending on how you did things, the first thing that you went and did was you went out and bought a whole lot of hardware, and you went out and you bought a whole lot of software, and that took up about half of that round. And so the cost of an idea in the software space, the opportunity cost was around $5 to $10 million. Well, you know, if every idea costs $5 or $10 million to test out, there's only a certain number of ideas that you're actually going to be able to get to the point where you prove their value and start to go into hyper-growth mode. If you look at where we are today, I would tell you that ideas cost about 90% less than they did at the point in time that I got started in this space. And that's because of a combination of things that have happened. Omnichannel clients, elastic infrastructure that allows us to essentially use hardware as we need it. Services that we can call on. When I was writing code, most of the developers that I worked with, we had what I would call a not invented here mindset. I didn't want to use a component framework that had been built by anybody else because I didn't have control over it. I couldn't fix it if there was a problem, if it didn't work the exact way that I needed it to. So I wrote pretty much everything myself, or the teams that I worked on wrote pretty much everything that we used. We're seeing the emergence of managed APIs. Now, open source software is a key part of this. One of the reasons that we see it being used in such a ubiquitous manner is because it goes back and reinforces point number 2, deployed on elastic infrastructure. Anybody here want to go talk to a purchasing officer in your organization to find out whether or not there's an additional license that you can use when your existing server's at 80% load and you need to spin another one up right away? That, for no other reason, is driving the adoption of open source systemically through modern application development. Now, from a development process perspective, we're also seeing the evolution of things like DevOps and measurable feedback as part of a development process as well. But open source is clearly one of the driving forces of modern application development. Now, we see this in our data. Every year we run a developer survey at Forrester, and this is about 1,700 devs in this response this year across 11 countries. Mix of IT developers, professional software developers working at software companies, students, even freelancers, and what we would call non-professional developers. When we ask them, what classes of open source software have you personally used to deploy applications in the past 12 months, we can see that it's pretty broad-based set of responses. 41% have deployed open source databases, 38% have deployed operating systems, 37% have deployed web servers. When you look at the folks that say, I have not used open source in the last 12 months, it's only about 1 in 5 developers. So when you look at the broad population of devs, including all the folks out there that are using Microsoft and that are using Oracle and that are using commercial enterprise software tools, most of them are using open source in some way, shape, or form. Now, a couple comments about this. We do these surveys year after year, and depending on which segment of the developer population we survey, we get higher or lower results. But in general, until this year, we have tended to see operating systems, web servers, and app servers be among the highest response rates. This year, we see RDBMS's lead in terms of adoption. We're starting to see, I think, a little bit of a shift in that market in particular. Previously, I think some of the things that we've seen in our client base is folks not necessarily ready to jump on MySQL or Postgres because they've been concerned about scalability, and they would stay with Oracle or DB2 or SQL Server because of that. It looks like we're now starting to see a shift even in that particular domain, and so that's a little bit of a change in the data that we're collecting. The other thing that I would say is we've seen a little bit of a tail off in app server reporting rates for open source use, not because I don't think that people aren't using open source app servers, but as we see people doing more and more modern application development, we're seeing less and less use of app servers at all. And we're seeing folks start to give way to different ways of implementing the server backend of applications. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Now, when we look at modern applications, we see some traits, some real differences to the previous generation of technology. And I want to talk about those because they're important to understanding why we expect to see more and more open source adoption in the future. So we see APIs everywhere. The current generation of devs, their first inclination is to look for a service that they can call or an API that they can use. I think that's awesome. And because of that, there's a lot of services out there for them to look at and use and call. Asynchronous communications. For the past 10 or 12 years, we've really been in the enterprise space locked into what I would call an MVC world. Do we use the .NET framework? Do we use one of the different Java frameworks? And do we use tightly coupled model view controller architectures? That sort of thing doesn't tend to work as well in the modern application space. You see a lot more message passing architectures. You see a lot more event-driven architectures. And a lot of the traditional frameworks that developers have used aren't very well suited to working in this world. So we need new frameworks. And a lot of those frameworks turn out to be open source frameworks, which we'll look at some of that data if you come to my session a little bit later this morning. We see lightweight process communication frameworks, things like WebSockets coming out, things like Node.js, the Nginx HTTP server, beginning to replace previous generation open source technology. So we're starting to run into situations where it's no longer open source alternative compared to commercial alternative. We're seeing open source technology versus another open source technology and substitution going on even in that space. A good example of that in the software configuration management or software code management space is what we see going on between Subversion and Git, where open source is being displaced by other open source. In-memory databases becoming extremely popular in modern application development for a variety of reasons, and in there we're seeing broad adoption of different open source options. We're seeing elastic infrastructure, and as I mentioned, the connection between open source and the ability to scale up or down without having to buy your max licenses for your max demand, one of the biggest values of open source. Sharded SQL or NoSQL databases, we see both in modern application architectures, and in the NoSQL space in particular, we see emerging dominance, I might say, for open source options in that space. Now, behind modern applications, what we are seeing is what we at Forrester refer to as a modern engagement architecture. So you still have systems of record that you need to support, maintain, and extend. A lot of them are going to be running in your data centers for the next 10, maybe even 20 years. But the systems that you're building on top of them, the mobile apps to arm your employees or go directly to your customers with, the web applications that you're building on top of them are being built in a very different way. We see a 4-tier architecture emerging as part of this engagement architecture. It starts with the services tier. It ends with a client tier across multiple devices. But in between those two extremes is an aggregation tier that is capable of aggregating services from your own data centers, from third-party APIs in real time, ingesting data from sensors in the Internet of Things, and using all of that data to predict the next best action that the application should take, to aggregate the context that lets you understand what an employee or a customer is trying to do. And then a delivery tier that enables you to get that information as close as it can possibly be to the client where it's ready for delivery. And we'll see folks using things like Amazon's CloudFormation in the delivery tier, having to push previously static DNS services to try to offer more dynamic behavior. And it's all based around trying to get that information out to the customer, to the employee, as quickly as possible with as high a performance as possible. An example of what one of these engagement platforms look like. If you take Netflix's architecture and you start to decompose it, you see all the different piece parts that go into a modern application, support across hundreds of different types of devices. Now, if you look very closely at this, what you'll start to see is there's open source libraries sprinkled throughout a modern application. In Netflix's case, they've got Denominator, which is something that they wrote in the delivery tier. They've got the Zool Edge service in their aggregation tier. They've got Cassandra, they've got Archaix, they've got Astyonics as well, almost completely built of open source architectural pieces. And it's not just Netflix. If you look at Evernote and how they build their infrastructure, if you look at Instagram and how they build their infrastructure, if you look at my favorite mobile application, Untapped, and look at how they build their architecture, you see this pervasive use of open source in modern application architectures. We see this in the data as well. When we in particular look at developers that have told us that they've built a cloud application, they've built a mobile application, or they've built a big data application in the past 12 months, we see the response rates almost at unanimous levels. 93% of cloud developers have used open source, 92% of mobile developers, 78% of big data developers. So a couple things going on there. One, the frameworks that they want to use that actually work are built in open source, and that's where the innovation is happening. So that leads me to my last point that I want to make today before we get started, which is increasingly, that innovation is being driven by open source communities. And we're seeing the formation of what I would refer to as collaborative collectives that are set to drive the innovation in our industry forward over the next 10 to 15 years. And those of us in enterprises, those of us that are looking to hire developers are going to have to understand how we restructure and reorganize ourselves to work with those collaborative collectives and to build on top of their work and to attract the talent that those collectives have managed to attract. Now, for the past couple of years, I've been asking a question in my developer surveys, which is, do you spend time writing code outside of your day job? And pretty consistently, from survey to survey across the past 3 or 4 years, about 70 to 75% of the developers that we survey say, yes, I write code outside of work. Now, some of them, they only spend a couple hours a week writing code on their own time. But some of them spend as much as 11 to 20 hours a week or more writing code on their own time. Now, think about that. How many plumbers do you know that plumb when they're not on the clock? Okay, how many you know? Not many, unless they're doing it for family or friends. That desire to write code on one's own time is driven by a variety of different motives: building your own tools, starting a new company, teaching yourself the latest technologies. But all of those motives represent intrinsic motivation. Doing something because it makes the developer feel good. It makes them feel an internal sense of happiness. Now, for those developers, about a little over more than 1 in 4 tell us that they contribute to open source projects as part of that time that they spend on their own coding. Now, I would tell you that I think some of those developers are the most talented, most creative, most productive developers out there. And if you believe that development is a creative pursuit, which I wholeheartedly do and have done research in that area over the past couple of years, you know that creativity tends to be fairly widely distributed. So if you are looking to hire talented developers, productive developers, I would suggest to you that there's a correlation between those that are working in the open source market and those that you want to attract to your organization. Now, why should any of the enterprise folks that are out there care about that? Well, I would submit to you, and this goes back to the golden age for developers comment, at least right now, that there is such a lack of top talent in our development space. Everybody is looking for the folks that know how to build modern applications, that understand NoSQL databases, that understand frameworks like Angular, that know how to put these things together on top of Amazon, on top of Azure or the Google Cloud Platform or IBM SoftLayer. If you have those skills and you know how to use the open source frameworks that are being used to build these applications, there's a very, very bright future ahead for you. Specifically, here in the US, we expect to see developer growth until 2020 of over 28%. The average starting salary for developers, or the average salary for developers, I should say, is looking pretty good at this point, $92,000. That's the average. The average starting comp sci salary is reported by Forbes in 2013, $70,300. Those numbers are pretty good. That shows that there is a demand-supply imbalance. And if you can stay at the top of your game, if you can use these technologies, if you can understand how they work, I don't think there's any reason that you can't stay on the top from a salary perspective as well. So some closing thoughts for this morning. We are in a generational technology shift. Modern applications are very, very different than the web-based applications we have built before in our own data centers. They are very different than the client-server applications that came before them. We have to understand the differences and understand how to use these technologies and use the elastic architectures which now allow us to stand things up very cheaply and innovate in a very inexpensive way. The elasticity of open source licenses make open source technologies a perfect fit for these new modern application architectures. Open source turns out to be natural for most developers now. 4 out of 5 use it, and they really don't give it a second thought. They use it because it works for them. Open source projects are driving the formation of collaborative developer collectives where innovation is happening. And these collectives, whether they hang out on forges like GitHub, whether they hang out in vibrant communities like the Drupal community, or whether they form foundations like the Apache Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation, represent the centers of gravity for development going forward into the next decade. Innovation is shifting to these collectives as the center of gravity grows around them. And finally, the demands for this talent create a seller's market. And that's why it's a golden age. So thank you very much, and I hope you come to my presentation later today.